Um, thank you, Rick. Thank you, Mike. And it's a pleasure to be back here in Massachusetts. As Mike mentioned, I've been a journalist for a long time now, and I recently made the move from our own Boston Globe to the nation's leading new media outlet, Politico. At least that's the way we like to think of ourselves. This has given me a rare opportunity to view journalism through an entirely different prism, kind of a front row seat to the astonishing changes in our industry. Those changes are, in themselves, a major factor in the 2016 presidential campaign. Now, we're going to have a chance afterwards to do some questions and answers and talk a little more about Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, but I thought that I would give you my sense of how the changing media landscape is affecting the campaign and really in some ways defining politics today. Now, it's safe to say that Donald Trump would probably not be the Republican presidential nominee today without these changes in the media landscape. Moreover, I think any serious observer of politics needs to understand the changes in the media to be able to predict what will come in future campaigns and to understand the information that you're getting from Washington. The best way for me to explain the changes in journalism and in our entire profession really is to take you back to the very first presidential campaign that I covered when I was still in my 20s as a young reporter for the Globe. It was 1992. Bill Clinton was running for the Democratic presidential nomination to take on George H.W. Bush. One of his opponents, Tom Harkin, was a senator from Iowa, and so the candidates largely conceded that state to its native son. That meant that for 6 months, almost every day, a field of 5 top leading Democratic candidates, plus the Republican insurgent who was taking on Bush, Pat Buchanan, took all of their campaigning, really, 6 months straight, in our backyard, New Hampshire. So from Portsmouth to Manchester to Lebanon to Keene, the candidates traversed the state every day, sometimes doing 5 or 6 house parties and sort of retail campaigning at that point. There was no internet, there was no iPhones, there were no trackers hired to follow these candidates. All the campaigning was on a retail basis. Moreover, the rest of the national media did not make the same commitment that the Globe did. The Globe said we would cover every one of these events. So I, as a young reporter, basically moved to Manchester and went from house party to house party covering some of these events. Some of the time, I was the only person there. It was just me sitting in a living room with the candidates and with the voters. I remember once up in Berlin, which is across the White Mountains, way up in north in New Hampshire, sitting with Bob Kerrey, the Nebraska senator, who was at the time considered like the leading challenger to Clinton. There must have been like 8 or 9 people there, and it was just us drinking coffee for a while. I also remember with Harkin being out at 5 in the morning in front of a factory shaking hands. Now, as you may imagine, especially as a young reporter, I wondered about how best to perform my mission. What was the proper role for a journalist in that position? Did I try to suss out any off-color remark, any awkward situation, any embarrassing exchange? Or did I try to convey with sort of wire service seriousness the overall substance of the conversation? The answer, unsurprisingly, was a little bit of both. After all, I'd only get a few paragraphs in the next day's Globe, and I wanted to make them count. I also wanted to sort of be true to some larger mission, which is, to really convey what the candidates were saying. But, you're also a watchdog, so there's an element of sort of putting these things in proportion. I think what's most noteworthy in retrospect, though, is that I was having this sort of inner dialogue, this kind of wrestling with journalistic responsibility at all. And yet I'm pretty sure that the other people working on the 1992 campaign, many of them were having that same sort of internal conversation. Bearing witness, which is what good journalists do, is a solemn responsibility when you are the only witness, and yours is the only reporter's notebook in the room. A few campaigns later, at a National Party convention, I had an illuminating conversation with none other than Dave Barry, the famous humorist who turned out to be a political junkie, and he would sort of take advantage of his position then with the Miami Herald to go to major political events, to go to conventions, to go to debates. He just liked sort of being a fly on the wall at that time. But looking back on 1992, he pointed out that at that time there were 4 or 5 reporters from the major outlets, like the New York Times, the Post, included the Globe in that list, maybe the news magazines, who would huddle after every debate to compare notes and essentially decide who won. At that time, the TV networks, which you may remember, would always be sort of scrupulously even-handed when they would cover the debates. Even if there was some wild gaffe or something, you know, the sort of initial takeaway would be, you know, they had a spirited exchange. It wouldn't be, you know, Gerald Ford really blew it. It would only be later that analysis would take hold. Now, to Dave Barry, that was a pretty shameful idea, that this very small group of white males would sort of sit in a room and kind of come up with a consensus position, a kind of common critique. And I think that was something that you heard a lot of in those days. There was a sense that that little cabal of journalists would sort of reward inside opinion, they would reward mainstream ideas, they would sort of, you know, rule against a candidate who thought outside the box. If somebody made an intemperate remark or an insensitive comment or something, they would get called out, they would be judged harshly, and that sort of media jury would rule against them. Now, among journalists, there was a lot of sensitivity to that critique. A lot of us felt we should just let the candidates have their say and concentrate on recording it accurately and even more importantly, sort of putting it in the proper context. Now that feels like a very, very, very long time ago. Today, there isn't a word that a candidate says that isn't recorded on a dozen iPhones, including those of the trackers that are paid by their rivals. Any remark that draws attention, whether in context, out of context, or, you know, outrageously misconstrued, is going to be broadcast and put out on the internet before any of us, even Politico, gets to post a news story. The analysis comes first in a wave of Twitter feeds before any group of reporters is able to sort of sit down and talk about anything. The decision about what to highlight is not made by some media cabal. It's made by the rival campaigns, which are putting out already, you know, tweets and posting videos and coming out with statements. So even if a news organization tries to exercise restraint, tries to make a decision on its own about what's news, the conversation is already galloping ahead without them. The candidates with their Facebook and Twitter followings that dwarf that of any media outlet can shape the news pretty much as they see fit. Now think about this. Donald Trump's total number of regular social media followers, Facebook and Twitter, exceeds the number of votes that's normally required to win a presidential nomination. So Trump can speak any day to this army of supporters who may or may not get news from any other source. Some of these people are devoted followers who just sort of believe that the news is what Trump says it is. For others, there's more of an openness, I think, to outside reports and viewpoints, but there isn't necessarily a lot of trust. In their minds, you know, all news is biased and you have to choose the trusted sources, or more likely, you know, just sort of crowdsource it. So people will share on social media stories no matter where they came from and rely on their friends to say, oh, wait a minute, that's a PR outlet, that's not a news organization. So I often think about this situation that we're confronting today in the new media, the media world that we're all living in, and wondering if it really is refreshing to the Dave Barrys who sort of bemoan the kind of media mandarins exerting all of that baleful influence. Today's news is certainly democratic. Anyone with an iPhone can be a journalist. Anyone can play in the game. We can all circulate our views. Now, however exciting this experiment in direct democracy may be, it's worth noting that it's not what the Founding Fathers intended. In drafting the Constitution, they included an explicit grant of freedom of the press. Now, the text of the First Amendment begins, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging freedom of speech, or of the press. What's worth pondering, I think, is this. Why mention the press at all? The term free speech can be construed to cover written communication. But there can be only one answer for what the Founding Fathers intended. They wanted a special protection for the press because they believed it was important that it exist as a separate and independent institution, a check on power, part of the constitutional balance of power and authority, just by virtue of its very independence and its special constitutionally protected status. Those of us in the national media today are still striving, still struggling, still trying to figure out how to fulfill that mission. And it's a tough question. Where once, 25 years ago, that question was all about restraint, about holding back your views, about controlling the analysis, letting the candidates have their say to at least avoid that Dave Barry critique. The question today is much more challenging. Just how do we fulfill our constitutional responsibility? Now, I should note, realistically, this isn't, of course, the only question confronting the media. In a business sense, we're struggling for our viability. Yet the two questions are related. If a free, fair, responsible media is to exist and raise enough funds through subscriptions and through advertising to pay the bills, it needs to serve an important function. And that function is no longer to be the gatekeeper of politics. The horses, so to speak, have left the barn. The candidates, the activist groups, the donors, the national parties control the dialogue. But if we can't keep the gate, we can at least play some role in guarding it. These days, readers, often older readers, will sometimes complain that the mainstream media focuses too much on trivial issues. I certainly hear that a lot. My response is that the candidates and their advocates focus on trivial issues, but that we would be unwise to ignore them totally. When, for instance, Trump declared that President Obama was the co-founder of ISIS, you remember this was a few weeks ago, and the mainstream media quickly jumped in and it became a sort of big story in Politico, but it was also a big story on cable television and other places. A lot of people were kind of raising their eyebrows, sort of saying, I heard a lot of complaints like, why pay attention to something stupid like that? Can't we just have a real discussion of the issues? And other people who are sort of Trump defenders would say, isn't Trump entitled to a little bit of rhetorical exaggeration? It was clearly he meant that Obama's policies allowed ISIS to emerge, not that he was literally the co-founder of ISIS. Keep in mind, speaking of Trump, this is a man who's never yet acknowledged that Obama was born in America. Today, he had his campaign put out a statement, but he's refused to do it personally. The majority of his supporters in polls believe that Obama is Muslim. Trump speaks every day through social media to millions of people who get their news, primarily through him. So at Politico, at the Globe, and the rest of the mainstream media, what we can provide is a check on that kind of baseless and perhaps deliberately misleading claim. But we can only provide a check, and a somewhat limited one. We can also try to track the millions of undisclosed dollars that are out there being injected into the political system every day. We can look at the very serious cracks and vulnerabilities in the voting system. We can look at the way that candidates seek to avoid scrutiny of their finances and, yes, their tax returns and their medical records. But we can't establish the political dialogue the way we did in the past. And we also can't just walk away and ignore it. It's our fate to have to prove our relevance, show our values every day without that old base of power that we had 25 years ago, the printing press. That's the real story of the changes in the media today and of the mountainous challenges that face us. I think we have a lot of work to do ahead of us, and we won't shrink from it. So thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's great to be back here and an honor to speak before AIM, and I'd love to answer questions.
So Peter's graciously agreed to stay and answer any and all of your questions, particularly regarding this year's election, presidential, Congress, whatever. So let's begin. I'm sure there's a lot out there. Over here. Yeah, hey, Jim.
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah, I'm happy. I mean, it's always a challenge. It's a challenge within the same parameters that I was discussing. How much of that is putting things in context, and how much of it is editorializing, and how do you kind of avoid sort of taking a side in that situation. But it's been a special challenge with the Trump campaign, frankly. So early on, when Trump was making kind of outrageous statements and things like that out on the campaign trail, the normal posture is to cover all the campaigns kind of equally and take seriously what each person is saying. But the Trump campaign seemed to be sort of a phenomenon in which the show was more of the story than the substance of what Trump was saying on a day-to-day basis. There was violence, there were protests, there was all kinds of things. So I'm actually quite pleased that at Politico we were able, I think, a little more quickly than some of the newspapers were, to kind of cover it as a spectacle. And I would say that, with the awareness that a lot of people would look at that and say, oh, look, there's the media making a decision to trivialize Trump or to, apply a different standard to him. But I think that was an appropriate editorial judgment about where the news was and what the substance of that campaign really was about. But it illustrates your concern that, we not fall into some sort of reflexive, give everyone the same amount of space and the same amount of attention when one person is basing their campaign on a serious set of ideas or throwing out a certain set of new proposals. Others, maybe like Trump, is basing it more on attitude, on swagger, on his ability to sort of attract angry activist following. And in that case, that's what we should cover. So I think it's a case-by-case basis. And I do hear that critique a lot, and that's a critique of that's quite common of the mainstream media these days, and I think it requires a little bit of adjustment. I mean, you and others know sort of why that policy was kind of in place, and it was to address what I was calling the Dave Barry critique, to try to be rigorously fair in every story and to have it be visible by, applying equal criticism and equal praise to all sides, but that's increasingly outmoded.
Back here, Joe. And there's a couple of microphones coming through. Joe, over here.
My mother always said I was loud.
Yeah.
You suggested that because of the campaign and Twitter and all that sort of the news feed has been democratized. Yet when I look at the news feeds of some major media outlets covering state, local, national political events, what you see is the sound bites. And it seems like there's still that rush to gain the eyeballs to the challenges mainstream media faces in sustaining itself in the world. It seems to me that the reporters have been sucked into that vortex and not stepping back and doing perhaps the analysis that we asked the mainstream media to do and almost feeding that frenzy of the superficial sound. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very big concern, and all of my remarks are kind of addressed at that particular dilemma. And I guess what I would say is, if the dominant issue in this dialogue that we in the mainstream media cannot control, that's the key point. If the view out there on the campaign trail in terms of what the candidates are saying, in terms of what their supporters are saying, in terms of what social media is saying, what everything is Hillary Clinton's health, it's not a very viable position for us to say, well, you know what, we think Hillary Clinton's health is a minor story. Okay, yes, she was, when she was diagnosed with pneumonia, we'll dutifully record that. But we're really going to talk here about policy on children and families, which is what the Clinton campaign is interested in talking about. It's a very hard decision to make. The other thing I would say, though, is that we have done stories about policies on children and families, and a lot of what people see tend to be those more flashpoint kind of issues. So I think even the readers who are disappointed with this kind of coverage, themselves will kind of be spotting it because it is, more easily accessible, and it does involve clash and controversy. But I guess the point I would make is that if we tried to ignore it in this environment, I mean, imagining this campaign and the way that issues have been presented in this campaign, we'd quickly become irrelevant or become sort of a sideline elite kind of read, of which there are many out there, in sort of magazines and things for a rather small, sophisticated readership. I could imagine Politico or the Boston Globe becoming that. But if you really want to talk to the general population and engage in the campaign as it's being fought out there, you can't easily step away from it.
Celia, you have one here, and then there's a couple over here.
Thank you for your speech. Matt Lauer was excoriated for his interview of Donald Trump, and Chris Matthews came to his defense and said, you need to be relatively impartial. So if I'm a candidate and you're interviewing me, and I make the statement that 5 is a greater number than 15, what do you think should happen next?
Yeah, I think Matt Lauer was not completely prepared. I mean, I only saw the highlights of that interview, so he may have been excellent at other points in the interview. So overall, I wouldn't say that. But the key one that you're talking about is when he's talking about how he always opposed the Iraq War, and Lauer's kind of nodding along, when everybody in journalism knows there's a piece of footage out there with him supporting it. He should have noted, but isn't there already a piece of footage of they supporting it? Can't you explain that, Donald? I mean, that would just be the most logical question. So that's why Matt Lauer was criticized, and that also is an example of why the media has to engage, why that sort of any of these kind of restraint postures, whether it's the fatal even-handedness or the we'll just let the candidates have their say, it is outmoded. I think in 1992, as the point I was making, when we really did control the dialogue, there was a genuine frustration that you would feel among people in politics. When you would sit around that kitchen table with people who are powerful senators, governors, whatever, they really were struggling to find a way to get some of these policy ideas out there. They still are to an extent. But there was a frustration with the media that people would only cover the gaffes and that only cover the controversies, and they wouldn't cover the substance in quite the same way. And there were so many people within the media. I think there's a whole kind of Washington Monthly cabal of they started at a small publication, and they like James Fallows and Nicholas Lemon and people like that. They dedicated their careers to we're going to cover substance. We're not going to be like this. But in 25 years, the landscape has changed so much that if you take that sort of pious position, you really do marginalize yourself. And I think that we're actually performing a better service trying to fact check and perspective check, some of these things. And so that's why Matt Lauer was not on top of his game in that interview.
Okay, so we're going to go here, and then Linda in the back.
Hi. So when I took my summer vacation this year, the first thing I looked at in the morning wasn't the Globe or the Times. It was, what is Nate Silver saying this morning in terms of So how Nate Silver and political cybermetrics, how does that change media approach?
Well, it's a little, it's kind of addictive. I mean, I'm addicted too, right? Although when you see the percentages change, you can sort of predict now where the percentages are going in some of those things. But I mean, even in 2012, I was a Nate Silver addict, and it's something that exists a little apart from the regular media coverage. It's a way of making polling more accessible for people who really are into politics. There's a lot of interesting analytics behind it that's worth exploring. I mean, the thing that's going to be a big challenge to Nate Silver and to everybody is that in 2012, everybody said that the changing nature of telephones has made polling more difficult, that it's much harder to reach people because so many people have given up landlines and you can't poll on cell phones, certainly not as easily because you can't get the numbers as easily. You also hear now that there's very little polling of Spanish language voters, for example, are they being underrepresented? And pollsters try to correct for these things by predicting what the cell phone only operators and what the Spanish language voters might be thinking, but they aren't polling them. Some are, but some aren't polling them entirely. Nonetheless, in 2012, we heard that the polls could be wildly off, and it turned out they weren't. It turned out the polls were kind of accurate in 2012. So now you hear it again in 2016, and I'm not going to hazard a guess whether they're going to be accurate or whether Nate Silver's going to have egg all over his face on election day, but we'll see.
I was just wondering if you could comment about the media's responsibility to actually put facts out there. So Education Week did a side-by-side comparison of Trump's and Clinton's education proposals, and it was just stark. And the kind of thing that I also think addresses some of the gender bias that I see in reports by putting out just those kinds of facts. And I'm wondering if Politico is planning to do that on any policy issues.
We have done that, and we have covered education policy, and we did a pretty substantive report on Clinton's speech about children yesterday. But as I was saying before, people, especially in this online world, will perhaps gravitate towards things that involve an ongoing clash, and the issue of was Obama born in Kenya or was he born in the United States might attract more eyeballs, independent of any decision made by the mandarins of journalism. When you refer to gender bias, I assume you meant gender bias against Clinton in this campaign, right? Yeah. And I mean, that's a matter of personal perception about these things. It certainly is a fact that Clinton has put out a lot more policy statements than Trump. She's also put out her taxes. She's put out more medical records. That's sort of been noted. But I agree with you that there probably could be more attention given to that. And as I said before, we don't control the dialogue necessarily. I assume that the Clinton campaign is going to work hard to make hay over those distinctions. And the dialogue will change a little after the debates as well. And I think that people in the media have tried very, very hard, especially on the tax issue, to get Trump to release his taxes. And we at Politico have done stories on it repeatedly. Every time a new moment comes along, whatever Donald Jr. I guess said yesterday or the day before that it would detract from his father's message if this came out. We made a big deal about that. So there's definitely an effort to kind of enforce transparency and substance in the campaign.
Donna, and then Beth, and then Dan.
Can you comment on the use of former campaign spokespeople as pundits, both on the air and in newspaper? What their opinions are based on where they used to work?
You mean used to work for different candidates and things like that? Yeah, I think the cable networks are mainly the people who do that. We don't have pundits at Politico, and we really don't quote pundits. That's we feel like it's part of our compact with our readers that we're not going to tell people what could be or should be. We're telling them sort of what's really happening right now, and there isn't much room for punditry in that equation. So I would say Politico is refreshingly pundit-free. We don't even have a lot of columnists or a lot of other outside voices weighing in. But nonetheless, I see all those cable TV networks every day, and you see nothing but people sitting around a table talking about politics. And, as you can tell, some of them try harder than others to have a more diverse group of people. But it does become kind of a predictable kind of food fight. I mean, when Trump emerged, it created a big challenge for the cable networks because the traditional Republicans weren't supporting him. So what looked like balance for them was, you have sort of several cuts of liberals and then you had several cuts of conservatives, but nobody was there defending Trump. So they found people who hadn't been pundits before, but would sort of stand up and say they were Trump supporters. So there are people like, Scotty Nell Hughes and things like that, who no one ever heard of before were suddenly appearing on national television just because they represent the Trump viewpoint. It's an honorable attempt by cable news to try to, cover a broader range of opinions, but, it's TV and people who are being hired because they're able to be sort of pithy and attractive and, attract an audience. I think that's what's going on.
Hi, I read a lot about the electoral math and how really this is going to be Clinton's election when you do the math. I'm wondering what your view is on that, as it doesn't always feel as if that's really where this is headed.
Well, the math changes. I mean, the things that's intriguing, you can, this is like Nate Silver, you can spend all day looking at the electoral map and thinking about it, is the argument, the reason people tend to say that is that she had been polling with double-digit leads in Colorado and Virginia that traditionally had been swing states, and New Hampshire also, she was polling very high. And so the argument was if she won Virginia, Colorado, and New Hampshire, she could lose Ohio and Florida. So the traditional view that Ohio and Florida are the battlegrounds, Trump could win those, but he would not necessarily win the presidency. There are a couple of little kinks in that. One is that Maine divides its electoral votes based on the 2 congressional districts, and Trump has been polling ahead in one of those congressional districts, so it would actually pull Clinton back by 1 vote that you would need if she lost that congressional district. So there goes that theory that she could win just by winning Virginia, Colorado, and New Hampshire, along with the very traditionally hardcore Democratic states. The other problem is that there's been a poll out this week or something showing a very tight race in New Hampshire and a tightening race in Virginia. So, these things can change all the time.
Peter, thank you. Great comments this morning. It seems we're such an angry, divided country, more than we've been in a very long time. When we think back in our history, there were major issues that caused divisiveness like this in the past: slavery, the Vietnam War, etc. So, a chicken and the egg question for you. We used to get our news largely from the same sources, the mainstream media, whether it was the big three networks, the Globe, etc. Now everyone can pick and choose to get their news from people who agree with them. Chicken and egg question for you. Did the splintering of the media lead to this divisiveness, or did the media follow the divisiveness? And is this the new normal, or is there any chance we're going to get away from that?
That's a fascinating question. I mean, everyone can apply their own theories. The one that I think is most compelling to me is that during the Cold War, we had a sort of national security consensus in this country that brought the 2 parties a little bit closer. You also had the very unusual phenomenon of having a lot of Southern loyalty to Democrats, particularly in Congress, even through the civil rights era, where the Democrats in Congress tended to be more conservative and anti-civil rights and stuff. So to get a lot of legislation through, you had Northern liberal Republicans joining up with Northern liberal Democrats and Southern conservative Democrats and Republicans in other states, Barry Goldwater, libertarians kind of combining for other pieces of legislation. So all the coalitions were bipartisan. And then you also had this umbrella of concern about national security that really did transcend those administrations. You didn't have a sense where the people who were advising Richard Nixon, even Henry Kissinger, were part of some Republican foreign policy establishment. They were, Kissinger started as a Democrat. They were largely similar people who had advised other presidents. Now, post-Cold War, we've lost that unifying factor, and the parties have become more ideological because certain states have become red and certain states have become blue. And Massachusetts is an example of that. We used to have 3 or 4 Republicans in the House delegation, and they were Siliconti, and we had Ed Brooke as a senator, and we had Peter Torkelson, whatever. You know some of these people. Now it's very solidly red. And so if you look at the delegation from Georgia and the delegation from Massachusetts, they're not going to see eye to eye, and they're going to be in different parties, and there's not going to be a lot of commonality. And we also have had these media changes taking place, which does make it much easier for people, particularly voters, to get information only from the places that they want to, and places that seem to validate their viewpoints. And then the candidates, even if they know better, feel like their constituents are only getting this one side, so they have to play to it. And that happens even in Massachusetts. I mean, we've had conversations with members of the Massachusetts delegation, engaged in interesting conversation with the Obama administration about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because there's probably very divergent views in this room about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but the Obama administration came to Massachusetts to try with a lot of statistics showing how free trade actually helps Massachusetts industries. And they felt that the Democrats in Massachusetts would be the kind of Democrats who could support TPP and give Obama some cover in this area. But, talking to many of the Democrats, they felt like their constituents were getting news from places that were very, very harsh on trade deals, and that a lot of constituents, weren't buying it. So, it's a phenomenon even here that people are getting information only from one side.
Thank you for your comments. I actually just came back from D.C. last night, and I had dinner on Wednesday night with 10 colleagues, half of whom were Democrats, half of whom were Republicans. And we had an interesting conversation about the election, and the collective sentiment from everybody around that table was that they, quote, wished we had some other option, whichever side you were on. And I'm wondering your thoughts on how you think that sentiment will affect each of the candidates and who benefits more from that sentiment. One person said they were not going to vote, and the cab driver who was listening to this conversation turned around and said, you have to vote, which I thought was interesting, but I am curious what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, unfortunately, they're not very satisfying because we really don't know. I think we have a story in Politico this morning about the extent that Gary Johnson is really taking votes away from Clinton rather than taking votes away from Trump. And I think that makes sense. At first a lot of people thought, well, he's a conservative alternative, so people who would otherwise vote for Trump are going to vote for Gary Johnson. In fact, what you've seen is, people who have rejected Trump, who feel like he's not presidential, he's not, whatever we think of him, he can't be president. Instead of going for Clinton, they're going for Gary Johnson, and particularly some of the recent polls have shown among voters under 25, he has more than a quarter of the vote. That sort of libertarian message is reaching young people. So that particular alternative, the Johnson-Weld alternative, I think is hurting Clinton quite a bit. In terms of the voter enthusiasm question, the conventional wisdom had been earlier that it was the enthusiasm problem was going to be entirely on the Republican side because so many conservatives are lukewarm about Trump, lukewarm or worse about Trump, and many of them would just stay home. So even if they're telling pollsters, yeah, on balance, they'd vote for Trump over Clinton, they'll find ways not to be showing up at the polls. But lately, the concern has been also on the Democratic side because Clinton has not inspired people, particularly young people, in a very strong way. And so much of the Obama constituency were people who tended to be a little bit lower income, people of color, more likely to be casual voters, either casual voters because they didn't believe strongly in the system and only wanted to vote for people that they really believed in, or just because they moved frequently and it's harder for them to register. And so the question is, if you are somebody who really identified with Obama, an African-American voter or somebody like that, do you go through all the rigor of getting registered if you've just moved in the last 4 years and coming out for Clinton? It's an interesting question, but there's no sort of definitive viewpoint right now. It's just like among your friends and colleagues discussing it.
Do the two major political parties remain, or do they splinter and become much more of a European model with multiple parties?
Well, I think they remain because they're pretty entrenched and they're pretty powerful right now. And I think the two-party system has served the country very well. But keep in mind, if you look at the history of the country, obviously the party's positions have shifted dramatically in many ways. So who would have thought that the Democrats would be the party of Wall Street now? And the migration of working-class blue-collar voters to the Republican Party seems to have accelerated strongly, with the Trump nomination. So I think what you'll see is that the parties will change tremendously, and there'll be a lot of internal dissension. It's in the Democratic Party, obviously, between the sort of Warren and Sanders anti-Wall Street wing and the much more establishment-oriented Democrats of the Clinton and even some of the Obama administration. But on the Republican side, it's going to be quite an identity crisis, and they're going to have even if Trump is elected president, there's going to be a lot of questions within the Republican Party about who they should be and what they should be, and there'll be a big constituent that will take the Ted Cruz view that they should be a conservative party that should be faithful and doctrinaire, and there'll be others who will say they've been that for the last 15 years, and it's status, and even if they won the presidency under Trump, they only did so by nominating somebody who rejected half of what the Congressional Party believes. So I think there'll be a lot of internal dissension on both sides, but I don't think there's going to be some third-party movement emerging.
I think we have time for just one more, and there's a question back here.
Thank you for your time this morning.
Yeah.
You shared your overview of that varied critique of homogenized or filtered messaging of '92, and then you shared your insight of the democratized or individual reporting of today. And what do you see happening 20 years from now? Is the presidency decided by a reality TV shows, or you think you can lead?
I know. Well, that's a very interesting. It's an interesting and unpredictable thing. Any more than we could have predicted 25 years ago where we'd be today. But you know, there's going to be a lot of discussion about the reality TV aspect of the nominating process. You know, it feels more democratic to have this kind of a state-by-state open election system. But you know, people will say there's been a vulnerability for a long time for that kind of celebrity candidate who you know, doesn't have political experience, doesn't you know, follow the same traditions as the other candidates in terms of releasing tax forms and medical records and providing policy statements and things like that, and is simply charismatic and telegenic. And you know, there probably will be some attempts to bring back a little more party control, but where that leaves us in 20 years, it's really hard to say. I do. One thing I would add to that, though, that might add some perspective on the celebrity question and everything, is that the anti-Washington stuff has kind of gotten out of hand, and you find that there's no incentive on either side for people to defend Washington. And you know, people who right now feel like it's just so shocking what Trump is out there saying should listen to Obama in 2008. He was running as an outsider, criticizing Washington, criticizing the system. He didn't want to stew in the system for too long and everything. And now he's defending Hillary Clinton because the system is so valuable in so many ways. And I think if even a man of integrity as Obama presents himself and as he is, you know, is not willing to, you know, talk about the value of government or the value of the Capitol, then you create a sort of permanent dynamic where whoever's the furthest outside the system is going to get a huge bump in the nominating process. So it's you know, and I'll look at another example, like look at the financial crisis and look at TARP, for example. I mean, you know, what's a better example of the value of government than TARP? And what's a better example of bipartisanship than TARP? Turned a profit. It prevented a depression. It kept the country on solid footing. Yet neither party sees fit to praise it. You know, to the Republicans, it was government intrusion in the economy. We can't possibly have that. You know, on the Democratic side, it was rewarding bankers for their mistakes or protecting them from the consequences of their mistakes, and that's terrible. It's not terrible. It was actually a wonderful illustration of what the public says it wants government to do, but nobody believes the government is capable of doing. But, you know, when push came to shove, it 100% was capable of doing it. You know, George W. Bush had a meeting. Obama was already the nominee. He was there. The two of them agreed. John McCain grumbled a bit, but eventually came aboard. Barney Frank grumbled a bit, eventually came aboard. It worked out fine, and nobody's out there defending it, and nobody in the general public seems to believe that it worked or that kind of policy works. So that's the world we live in.
So Peter, I said that would be the last question, but I actually have one for
Sure.
you. And that would be, we haven't talked much about the congressional elections, and I haven't seen much recently in the news about that. Early on, there was some speculation the Senate might flip from Republican to Democrat. What's the thinking now?
It's changed. The thinking is that it's probably 50-50 on what's going to happen with the Senate. And the reason is that some incumbent senators who appeared to be in trouble, like John McCain, Chuck Grassley, a few others, are now polling significantly ahead. I think the conventional wisdom is that the Democrats will win the Illinois seat that Mark Kirk has and the Wisconsin seat that Ron Johnson has, but they need 3 more. And, you know, you guys see all the ads from New Hampshire. It's very hard to predict what's going to happen there. You know, the other thing is that usually the candidate that wins the presidency will flip all of those Senate races. So if Clinton were to win by even 4 or 5 points, she'd probably be able to control the Senate. But it's also kind of a weird year, you know, and some of those people voting for Clinton may also vote for Kelly Ayotte. You know, you never know. So that's another thing it's hard to predict. I will make one prediction, though. There's one question that didn't really come up, and that is one of the legacies of the 2016 election is going to be more attention to the plight of the blue-collar worker, largely white, the former factory worker, the industrial base. And I think that's a very valid phenomenon. I remember in 2004 going to Youngstown, Ohio, which was just hollowed out. You know, there was literally an airport with no flights. You know, it was like this empty airport. And at the end of this desolate road, there was a VFW post. And, you know, it was like an Edward Hopper painting. You know, everyone like slumped over the bar. It was a terrible scene. And you think, I thought at that time, you know, here you had John Kerry talking about the importance of balancing the budget, which he was really focused on then, and how that could lead to some more economic growth. And you had George W. Bush talking about, you know, Iraq and war and fighting terrorism. The people there were, even though it was a military setting, were very depressed about the war. But they were going for Bush over Kerry because they saw Bush as just, you know, it seemed like a nod to them. You know, he's talking about the value of the military. Okay, somebody's paying a little bit of attention to them. But there was nothing on the economic front that offered them any sense of immediate hope. That has been a dynamic in politics. It's become part of, you know, the concern about the hollowing out of the Midwest and other things. Trump has played a role in putting that constituency kind of front and center. Right? You can all debate whether killing trade deals is going to be the big solution there or not. But I think even some of the Democratic proposals, like free college tuition and retraining through community colleges and things like that, are, you know, responding to that constituency and the need for greater attention to that constituency. So I think for those of you in AIM who have manufacturing businesses or are concerned about the plight of gateway cities or what's happening outside the knowledge economy, a lot of policies in a kind of, you know, not very visible way will be geared a little more towards those concerns in the next 4 years, whether it's Clinton or whether it's Trump. And I think that will be a meaningful change. So thank you. Great.